It was 9:42 a.m. on a cool Jacksonville morning, June 18, 2019. The kind of morning that felt like a fresh beginning. For Margaret Hayes, it truly was. A 63-year-old widowed mother and grandmother, she had just remarried 3 days earlier after losing her first husband. A woman of faith, Margaret believed her prayers had finally been answered. She had hope again. That Tuesday, she was simply driving down Merrill Road, on her way to the grocery store before brunch. It was supposed to be an ordinary day. But ordinary is not what happened. Down the road, a silver sedan sat crumpled against a bulldozer at a construction site. Dust floated in the air, mixing with the sharp scent of burnt rubber. Margaret's purse lay open on the pavement, its contents scattered like fragments of her life. Sirens wailed closer. But inside the twisted wreck, Margaret Hayes was bleeding out of time. Investigators began to whisper. Something about the brakes didn't look right. And in the hours that followed, while her family clung to one another in shock, Margaret's new husband of only 3 days was already making phone calls. Not the kind of calls you'd expect from a grieving man, business calls. Calls that would unravel everything. So was this tragedy simply a woman losing control of her car? Or was there something far more deliberate, something darker, hiding in plain sight? Let's find out together. Before we continue, this is the Crime Catalogue. Stay tuned, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Margaret Hayes was born in 1956, right here in Jacksonville, Florida. The youngest of 3 children, she grew up in a modest home where faith wasn't just preached, it was lived. Sundays meant pressed dresses, hymnals clutched in hand, and long dinners with neighbors who felt more like family. Her childhood was simple, safe, and anchored by values that would shape her entire life. Kindness, service, and devotion. By her late 20s, Margaret had met James, her first true love. He wasn't the flashiest man, but he was steady, dependable. The kind of man who promised to love her not just in the bright seasons of life, but in the storms too. And for decades, that's exactly what he did. Together they built a life marked not by wealth, but by meaning. They raised children, welcomed grandchildren, and filled their home with laughter, gospel music, and the smell of home-cooked meals. But storms always come. In the mid-2000s, James fell ill. At first, it was small things. Fatigue, trips to the doctor that felt routine. But then came the diagnosis. A long, grueling illness that would slowly take the man Margaret had built her life with. She became his nurse, his confidant, his anchor. Through countless hospital visits, sleepless nights, and quiet prayers whispered in the dark, Margaret stood by his side. 4 years, she put her own needs aside to care for him. And when he passed away in 2014, after nearly 40 years of marriage, her world collapsed. Grief is heavy, but for Margaret, it was also lonely. The house felt too quiet, her days too long. She leaned on her faith, she leaned on her church, she even poured herself into community service, volunteering at food drives, helping widows like herself, and mentoring younger women in the congregation. But still, there was an ache. Margaret missed companionship. She missed laughter in the evenings, someone to share stories with over coffee, someone to hold her hand in prayer. Her children, now grown with families of their own, saw the sadness in her eyes. They urged her to take joy in her grandkids, to keep busy, but Margaret longed for something deeper. She often prayed for God to send her someone, not to replace James, but to give her heart another chance at love. In quiet conversations with her daughter, Margaret admitted the truth. "I just want one last chance," she said softly. "One last chance at love before my time is done." And so, she kept her heart open, trusting, hoping, believing that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't finished yet. But when someone longs for love after loss, how vulnerable does that make them? David Collins was born in 1991, nearly 35 years after Margaret first opened her eyes in Jacksonville. He grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, a world that moved fast and often left him behind. From the start, stability seemed to slip through his fingers. Jobs came and went. Retail, sales, odd contracts that promised big returns but rarely delivered. Money was always tight, debts always close behind, and his charm often became his greatest asset. Because if there was one thing David learned young, it was that words could open doors money could not. Those who knew him in Atlanta whispered about his gift, how he could walk into a room and instantly make you feel like you mattered, like you were the only one worth his attention. But there was another side too. Behind that disarming smile was a man who bent the truth as easily as he breathed. A man who often saw people less as companions and more as stepping stones. When his debts began closing in, when the promises of quick money dried up, David packed a small bag and left Atlanta. He told acquaintances he was heading south for a fresh start. But what he carried with him wasn't just hope. It was desperation. And Jacksonville, quiet, church-centered Jacksonville, was where he landed. A new city, a new stage. One Thursday evening, while members of a small congregation gathered for Bible study, David slipped into the back row. The lights were soft, the room filled with the gentle hum of voices reading scripture. He was introduced to the community as a young man seeking God again, and almost instantly, heads turned, not just because of his presence, but because of the way he carried himself. He was 28 years old, tall, well-spoken, eager to share pieces of his testimony about starting over. It sounded convincing, as if redemption itself had walked in the door. And among those listening that night was Margaret Hayes, a woman of faith, still healing, still quietly asking God if love was possible for her again. She saw him as a symbol of hope, someone younger, full of life, maybe even someone sent to remind her that prayers could still be answered in unexpected ways. He called her his angel, and for Margaret, those words carried a weight she hadn't felt in years. But not everyone was swept away. In hushed conversations, friends exchanged glances. The age difference, 28 years, was too wide to ignore. Some wondered quietly what David was looking for in a woman already past 60. Others said love doesn't always follow rules, that maybe he truly had found what his heart was searching for. Margaret silenced the doubts with her faith. She believed people could change, that everyone deserved grace, and maybe, just maybe, this was her second chance. But what Margaret didn't know was that behind David's carefully chosen words lay something darker. The debts he carried, the schemes he quietly entertained, and how, to him, Margaret's life, her stability, her home, her trust, looked less like companionship and more like a lifeline he intended to hold on to. So, when someone walks into your life appearing too perfect, too fast, too eager to call you their angel, do you question their intentions? Or do you accept the miracle and pray you won't be wrong? The months that followed David's first steps into Margaret's world were like pages torn from a fairy tale. At least, that's how she described it to anyone who asked. Their days were filled with walks by the riverfront, hands interlocked as if they'd been joined for decades. There were coffee dates that stretched into hours, where David listened with a tenderness Margaret had longed for. At church prayer meetings, they sat side by side, heads bowed, the image of devotion itself. People whispered about their age difference, but to Margaret, it felt as if heaven had finally answered her prayer. After years of loneliness, after nights spent whispering to God for companionship, here was a man who told her daily that she was his angel, and she believed it. Margaret glowed in a way her friends had not seen in years. She wore brighter dresses, sang louder during worship, and even caught herself smiling at her reflection in the mirror. "I feel alive again," she told her closest circle. But those same friends, those who had walked with her through grief, saw something else. They saw how quickly this man had entered her life, how swiftly he moved to become central to it. They saw Margaret's daughter, Laura, try to intervene. Laura, who loved her mother fiercely, reminded her that love takes time, that no one truly shows their heart in a matter of weeks. But Margaret's answer was always the same. "He makes me feel young again." And wasn't that something she deserved after so much loss? Yet beneath the soft glow of new love, shadows were forming. David pressed Margaret with questions, small ones at first, easy to dismiss. What kind of insurance had James left behind? Did Margaret still own the deed to her home outright? How much had she saved for retirement? She brushed it off as curiosity, the kind that comes with dreaming about building a future together. But David was persistent, threading those questions into casual conversations, making them seem innocent, even natural. And then, his urgency began to show. "Why wait?" he asked her one evening, as they sat across from each other at the little Italian restaurant where he first told her she was the answer to his prayers. "Why wait on marriage when God has already brought us together?" It sounded noble, wrapped in faith, sealed with devotion. To Margaret, it was intoxicating. To Laura, it was alarming. She pleaded with her mother, warning that real love does not rush. But Margaret, blinded by hope, could not see what her daughter saw so clearly. The romance that had started with sweet words and prayerful hands soon veered into legal papers and binding promises. Just weeks before the wedding, David persuaded Margaret to update her will. He told her it was about being prepared, about ensuring their new life together was in order. And then came the life insurance policy, framed not as a burden, but as security, for her, for him, for the love they were building. Margaret, with her heart wide open, signed. She signed because she believed love had finally knocked at her door a second time. She signed because she wanted to trust again, to embrace life instead of living in fear. She signed because David Collins had convinced her that love was worth the risk. But in truth, those signatures would become the first chains in a trap carefully set. Margaret could not yet see that behind every promise of forever was a man who carried debts, secrets, and a hunger that love could never satisfy. And so the question lingers, an uneasy echo that hangs in the air. When someone moves too quickly, when they press too hard, when love begins to look like a contract more than a covenant, do you see it as devotion? Or do you recognize it for what it truly is? A red flag waving in the storm ahead. The church smelled of fresh lilies that June morning, sunlight streaming in through stained glass windows that cast soft blues and reds across the pews. Margaret Hayes walked slowly down the aisle, her arm linked with her daughter Laura's, the lace of her dress brushing lightly against the floor. At 63, she carried herself with a grace that made her look years younger. Her face, glowing with joy, seemed to tell the story of a woman who had endured heartbreak but still believed in love's second chances. Guests whispered about how radiant she looked, how her smile had returned after so many years of widowhood. For Margaret, this day was not just a wedding, it was the renewal of hope. David Collins stood waiting at the altar, hands clasped behind his back, a picture of calm confidence. At 28, he looked sharp in his fitted navy suit, his gaze never leaving Margaret as she drew closer. To the congregation, he played the part of a devoted young husband-to-be, offering smiles, leaning into his role as the man who had given Margaret's heart reason to beat fast again. Yet for some watching, particularly Laura and a few close friends, his calmness carried something unnerving, as though he was too composed, too practiced for a day of such raw emotion. The ceremony was small, intimate, with only family and church members in attendance. Pastor Richard, who had first welcomed David into the Thursday Bible study months earlier, spoke warmly about the unexpected ways God brings people together. He praised the couple for finding love despite the years and challenges that separated them. Margaret's friends clapped politely, though some exchanged glances that revealed their unease. The age gap, the speed of the romance, the subtle red flags, those whispers lingered in the pews, though few dared to voice them aloud in such a sacred moment. When it came time for the vows, Margaret's voice trembled with emotion. She spoke of second chances, of being grateful for answered prayers, of the way David had reignited her joy. "You make me feel alive again," she said, her hands trembling as she slid the ring onto his finger. David, in turn, leaned close to her and whispered words that only she could hear, though the smile that crossed her face told everyone it was something tender. To the audience, he said his vows with confidence, promising to protect, to cherish, to love until his dying breath. Applause rang through the church when they were pronounced husband and wife. Margaret leaned into his kiss, her eyes closed as if sealing the moment into memory. For her, it was a new beginning, the first step into a life she had prayed for. For David, though, it was something far colder, far calculated, an endgame carefully plotted, the securing of a place, a fortune, and a future that had less to do with love and more to do with survival. The reception was modest, held in the fellowship hall just behind the sanctuary. There was cake, gospel music playing softly, and friends offering congratulations. Laura smiled for her mother's sake, but inside, worry churned. She had tried to warn Margaret, tried to point out the speed, the demands, the subtle financial conversations that David had brought into their lives. But her mother's happiness had blinded her to doubt, and Laura, out of love, held her tongue as she hugged her mother tight that night, whispering a prayer for protection. Guests described the atmosphere as bittersweet. There was laughter, but under it ran an unspoken tension. Many were happy for Margaret, but they couldn't shake a feeling they couldn't quite name. Margaret, though, ignored it all. She swayed in David's arms during their first dance, whispering about how she finally felt like a bride again, how she had waited so long for this. And David? He nodded, smiling, but his eyes often darted toward the older guests, the family members, as if measuring who might suspect, who might stand in his way. The night ended with cheers and sparklers outside the church doors, Margaret waving as she and David drove away. It was a picture-perfect ending to what she thought was the first chapter of a new love story. But what no one knew, not Margaret, not Laura, not even Pastor Richard, was that this story was already racing toward its tragic climax. Because 3 days later, Margaret Hayes would not live to see her new husband again outside the sterile walls of a hospital. And so the question hangs heavy for us all. When love feels like a miracle, how do we tell the difference between destiny and danger? June 18, 2019. It began as an ordinary summer afternoon, the kind of day that offers no warning of what it is about to take. Margaret stepped out of her home with a gentle smile, her hair pinned back neatly, her purse swinging lightly against her side. She leaned into the doorway, called a cheerful goodbye, and promised she wouldn't be long, just a short drive to the grocery store. The sound of the car door closing echoed down the quiet street, followed by the familiar hum of her engine. Neighbors would later recall how calm everything had seemed, how nothing about the moment suggested the catastrophe about to unfold. The road stretched downhill, framed by trees heavy with leaves, and for the first few seconds everything was normal. But then, without warning, Margaret's car surged forward, picking up speed far too quickly. Tires screeched, rubber burned, and a panicked horn pierced the silence as the vehicle tore uncontrollably down the incline. Witnesses would never forget the sight. Margaret gripping the wheel, her eyes wide with terror, her lips moving as though she were crying out for help that never came. A worker at the roadside construction site dropped his tools and shouted, but it was too late. The final moments were violent and devastating. The car veered across the lane, collided head-on with a parked bulldozer, and crumpled in a sickening roar of twisted metal. Glass shattered, smoke rose, and the acrid scent of gasoline and scorched rubber filled the air. Strangers rushed forward, desperate to pull her from the wreckage, but Margaret was unconscious, her body still, her hand limp on the steering wheel. At the hospital, the fight for her life was short-lived. Doctors tried everything, but the injuries were catastrophic. At 5:42 p.m., Margaret was pronounced dead. The sound of the monitor flatlining carried a finality that no one present could forget. Hours earlier, she had left home smiling. Now, she lay lifeless, her body broken by a crash that seemed both random and merciless. When David arrived, his anguish was on full display. He rushed down the corridor, his cries echoing, his face streaked with tears. In his trembling hands, he clutched Margaret's wedding ring, pressing it against his lips as though trying to draw comfort from a symbol now emptied of its promise. To those watching, his grief looked raw, unrestrained, and devastatingly human. But for the investigators standing in the background, a shadow of doubt had already begun to form. The accident appeared straightforward, an unfortunate case of mechanical failure, a car gone out of control. Yet within hours, subtle cracks began to show. A witness recalled something strange about the way the car accelerated. Too smooth, too deliberate, as though the brakes had never been applied. Others noted the uncanny timing. David's arrival at the hospital was almost too quick, as if he had been waiting, watching. By the end of that day, the scene of tragedy had already shifted into the scene of suspicion. Margaret's death looked like a terrible accident, but buried within the wreckage lay David's first fatal mistake. Laura could not shake the gnawing unease that had settled in her chest. Margaret was gone, and while grief should have bound the family in silence and mourning, David's behavior pulled everything in the opposite direction. She had watched him weep, but his sorrow felt rehearsed, as though he were performing for an unseen audience. His sobs came too loudly when others entered the room, yet his eyes stayed stubbornly dry. Even the way he reached for tissues, pausing to glance around first, felt more like stagecraft than instinct. Laura said nothing, but every gesture carved the suspicion deeper into her bones. Detectives had begun to notice as well. What struck them most was not his crying, but his speed. Just hours after Margaret was declared dead, before her body had even left the hospital, David placed a call that stunned them. He dialed her life insurance provider. The timestamp was undeniable, 8 hours after her passing. The agent on the other end, a seasoned professional used to handling families in grief, had noted how clinical his voice was, how quickly he asked for the payout process. It didn't sound like a man crushed by loss. It sounded like a man checking off a task. When investigators pulled the hospital log and compared it to the call record, they exchanged looks that spoke volumes. The cracks in his facade grew wider by the day. At gatherings, David would bury his face in his hands when neighbors offered condolences, but the moment they turned away, his expression slipped back into something cold, calculating, almost bored. Laura noticed it most during the late hours, when she caught him alone in the kitchen, staring at nothing, lips moving silently as if rehearsing lines. Grief was messy, unpredictable, but David's was tidy, precise, and practiced. Then came the moment that shifted everything. A neighbor, reluctant at first, approached detectives with a small admission. Her security camera, mounted high above her garage, had captured faint movement on the day Margaret died. It was grainy, the kind of footage that required patient eyes and repeated viewing. The detectives leaned in close, rewinding again and again, each replay sharpening what they thought they saw. A figure moved in and out of the shadows. At first glance, it was nothing but a shape, but the longer they studied it, the more the outline became familiar. The posture, the gait, even the subtle turn of the head resembled someone they knew all too well. They sat in silence, the flickering screen filling the room, until finally one of them whispered what everyone else was already thinking. The shadow looked like David. The investigation began with routine steps, detectives walking the stretch of road where Margaret's car had crashed. The summer sun cast long shadows across the construction site, illuminating twisted fragments of metal and broken glass that still littered the ground. What at first looked like a tragic mishap began to unravel under the keen eyes of the forensic team. A specialist, crouched by the wreckage, ran his gloved hand along the underside of the car's frame. Then came the pause, the kind of pause that draws everyone's attention. He pointed to the brake line, its rubber tubing sliced clean, the cut precise, intentional. This was no accident of wear and tear. It was deliberate. A mechanic's hand, or someone who wanted to be sure that when Margaret pressed her foot on the brake, nothing would respond. The detectives exchanged glances, their faces hardening as the realization settled in. Margaret's death wasn't fate. It was engineered. The next step was obvious. Who had access to the car? Who had motive? Who stood to gain? Their answers came faster than expected. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera provided the first real thread to pull. The grainy black and white video captured David, just a night before the accident, entering the garage. He moved quickly, confidently, as if he belonged there, and of course he did. He was the husband, the one person nobody would question for being near Margaret's car. But then the footage showed him crouching low by the driver's side. His figure was partially obscured, but his actions were deliberate. Minutes later, he stood, wiping his hands on a cloth before slipping a small toolkit back into its case. When the detectives watched the tape, there was no mistaking it. David wasn't just grieving. He was a man who had planned, calculated, and executed. The irony was heavy. His tears at the hospital, his shaking hands clutching Margaret's wedding ring, suddenly rang hollow. In light of this footage, it all felt rehearsed. And here lies the question, the one investigators themselves asked as they stared at the screen. If you saw this tape, would you believe the sobbing husband, Or would you finally see the truth lurking behind those tears? The answer was beginning to write itself. David was no widower by cruel twist of fate. He was a man who had staged tragedy, hoping no one would look closely enough to see the strings he had pulled. June 25, 2019. The investigation began to cut through the fog of grief and into something darker. Detectives turned their attention to the financial records, always a trail that spoke louder than tears. What they found shocked even seasoned investigators. Just weeks before the wedding, on June 1, 2019, David and Margaret had signed a life insurance policy worth a staggering $750,000. The ink was barely dry on their marriage certificate when David was named the sole beneficiary. On its own, it might have seemed like a reasonable precaution for a newly married couple, but paired with his odd behavior in the days following Margaret's death, it reeked of premeditation. Margaret's home, valued at nearly $400,000, was under both their names now. Her retirement account held another $120,000. Together, her assets, combined with the life insurance, meant David stood to walk away with more than $1 million. For a man whose personal accounts were in constant overdraft and whose credit card bills painted a picture of quiet financial desperation, this was motive spelled out in numbers. When investigators combed through David's emails and bank statements, in the weeks before the wedding, while Margaret was giddy with love and planning flower arrangements, David was typing cold, calculated queries into his laptop. How long does life insurance take to pay out? Can newlyweds take out large policies? Does payout increase if death is accidental? The search history painted a portrait of a man not consumed with love, but with strategy. A man already rehearsing the financial future he could secure if tragedy struck. What made investigators' blood run cold was the timing. He wasn't researching these things after their vows, in some spur-of-the-moment panic. No, this was all before the wedding. David had been charting a path that ended in Margaret's death before she even walked down the aisle. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't a freak accident. It was a roadmap to murder disguised as devotion. Detectives sat with the documents spread across the table. The insurance policy, the property deed, the retirement accounts, the search history. They looked at one another and knew what they were holding. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was the skeleton of a motive, dressed in numbers and signed contracts. But the hardest part was still to come. David had charmed everyone so far with his crocodile tears and trembling hands. Confronting him wouldn't just require evidence. It would require breaking through the mask he wore so convincingly. The room was heavy with silence as the lead investigator closed the folder with a firm snap. "He thought he was going to get rich," she muttered. "But what he's going to get is life in a cell." And as detectives prepared to bring David in for questioning, they held one thought in mind. Behind every signature, every email, and every tear he had shed at the hospital, Margaret's voice still echoed. She had trusted him. She had married him. And he had turned love into ledger lines. When investigators finally sat across from David with the truth in their hands, the mask he had so carefully constructed would have to crack. And when it did, the world would finally see the man behind the grieving widower act. The interrogation room was a cold, sterile space designed to make even the innocent sweat. David sat across from two seasoned detectives, his hands clasped together, knuckles white, his expensive wristwatch glinting beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. He maintained a calm demeanor at first, leaning on charm and indignation. "You're targeting me because I'm younger," he insisted, his voice controlled but firm. "If the roles were reversed, no one would question this marriage. She loved me. I loved her. That's all." The detectives let him talk, their silence a calculated weapon. Then, slowly, they began to chip away at his facade. One slid a folder across the table, opening it just enough for David to see the first damning image. Grainy surveillance footage of him in the garage, crouching by Laura's car with a toolkit. David's jaw tensed, though he tried to maintain composure. "That's not what it looks like," he muttered, the confidence in his voice thinning. The detectives pressed further, their tone tightening like a noose. "Then tell us, David. Why were you under her car? Why did you walk out with a toolkit?" And why does the brake line look like it was sliced clean with a blade? His breathing grew heavier, and his rehearsed explanations started to falter. He shifted in his chair, sweat pooling at his temple despite the cold room. As the questioning escalated, they laid out the forged documents, insurance forms with Laura's signature trembling unnaturally, inconsistent with her careful handwriting. A forensic handwriting expert's analysis was included, each page marked with evidence tags. David glanced at them briefly, then looked away, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. "You see, David," one detective said, leaning closer, "love doesn't look like this. Love doesn't have you calling an insurance company 8 hours after your wife's body hits the pavement. Love doesn't slice brake lines. This isn't about age. This is about greed, calculation, and murder." For the first time, David's mask cracked. His eyes darted from the footage to the documents, then to the detectives. His breathing turned shallow. He tried deflecting, stammering about conspiracies and misunderstandings, but his voice betrayed him, thin, uneven, desperate. The silence that followed weighed heavily, broken only by the sound of his nervous fidgeting. Finally, under the unrelenting pressure, his composure collapsed. His head dropped into his hands, his words tumbling out in fragments, muttered half-confessions that made the detectives exchange a knowing glance. Though he never said the words directly, his cracks were enough. They had what they needed. On July 9, 2019, David was placed under arrest, charged with murder, insurance fraud, and evidence tampering. The cameras caught his image as he was led out in handcuffs, still trying to shield his face, but unable to hide the truth any longer. The story could have ended there, but the true depth of David's scheme, and the chilling coldness of his intent, was still to come. The trial would lay bare the manipulations, the betrayals, and the meticulous planning that made Laura's death not a tragedy of fate, but a premeditated act of greed. And as the world would soon see, David's mask of grief was nothing but theater, a performance that crumbled the moment the evidence spoke louder than his lies. On the first court-sitting day, the courtroom was overflowing, a sea of anxious faces pressed into wooden benches, the air thick with tension. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras waited outside the courthouse doors, and every eye inside seemed fixed on David, seated in his suit, his face pale but unreadable. The trial had drawn the community together, not out of curiosity alone, but because this case felt personal. It was a story of trust shattered and love turned into a weapon. The prosecution opened with fire. They laid the cut brake line across the screen for the jury to see, each jagged edge a silent testament to malice. Insurance calls and forged papers were read aloud, the monotone of clerks and experts punctuated by sharp questions from the prosecutor that left no room for doubt. The defense tried to paint David as misunderstood, a grieving widower who had made poor choices but not a killer. They leaned into his calm demeanor, into his insistence that he loved his wife. But the evidence kept mounting, like waves crashing against a frail boat, and the cracks in his story showed clearly under cross-examination. The daughter's testimony was the moment that silenced even the shuffle of papers. She walked to the stand, her hands trembling as she held the Bible, her voice barely above a whisper at first. Then it cracked into something raw, carrying grief that no courtroom could contain. She thought she found happiness, she said, her eyes locked not on the jury but on David. Her words hung in the air like a wound, and some jurors blinked hard to fight back tears. David shifted in his chair, jaw tightening, but he never met her gaze. The defense objected to the emotional weight, but the judge overruled. Truth, in its purest form, had found its way into that courtroom. When the jury retired, the hours stretched into an eternity. 5 long hours of deliberation felt like days. Families huddled in the gallery, the daughter wringing her hands, whispering prayers. David sat stone-faced, but his lawyers whispered in hushed, frantic tones, trying to prepare for the worst. The tension broke only when the jury filed back in, solemn, their foreperson clutching the folded verdict slip. The air grew so still it seemed the walls themselves were listening. "Guilty," the foreperson declared, and the word rang out like a gavel before the gavel. "Guilty on every count." Gasps swept through the room, and the daughter collapsed into sobs, her body shaking with both relief and grief. Reporters scribbled harder, some even weeping quietly themselves, and the defense's shoulders slumped in quiet defeat. David sat unmoving, the verdict washing over him with no visible crack in his mask. The judge leaned forward, his voice heavy, deliberate. "You didn't marry her to love her," he said, pausing so that the silence itself seemed to lean closer. His eyes bored into David's. "You married her to bury her." The words dropped like a stone, and David finally flinched, his lips pressing thin, his composure slipping for the first time. The sentence was life without parole, the chains clinking as if to underline that his life of freedom was done. As the gavel struck, justice felt both triumphant and hollow. The community had its verdict, the system had spoken, but in the gallery, the daughter wept into her hands. There was no bringing her mother back, no undoing the betrayal that had stolen so much more than a life. The cameras outside would flash, the headlines would declare justice served, but inside that courtroom, everyone knew, justice does not erase pain. It only seals it in history. And as David was led away, shackled and defeated, the daughter's sobs were the last sound that lingered, echoing long after the doors closed. The trial was over, but the echoes of what had unfolded lingered like smoke after a fire. Margaret's story was not just about murder. It was about the way love itself had been twisted into a weapon. She had wanted what so many of us want: companionship, trust, and the comfort of believing she was finally safe in someone's arms. Instead, she found herself bound to a man who saw her not as a partner, but as a payday. Love became a tool of manipulation. Trust became the snare that trapped her. And in the end, betrayal came not from a stranger lurking in the shadows, but from the very person she had vowed to share her life with. It forces us to confront a chilling reality. Sometimes the greatest dangers are not the threats we see coming from outside, but the ones smiling at us across the dinner table. Margaret's story is not isolated. It reflects a pattern that stretches far beyond one courtroom, reminding us of how easily vulnerability can be exploited when cloaked in the language of affection and devotion. So I ask you, my listeners, if this were your mother, your sister, or your closest friend, what would you have done? Would you have noticed the warning signs, the sudden shift in finances, the isolation, the small red flags that seemed harmless at first? Could this crime have been prevented if someone had stepped in sooner? Or was Margaret doomed the moment David set his sights on her? These questions are not meant to haunt, but to challenge, to be more vigilant, more present, more willing to confront what we'd rather not see in the lives of those we love. Justice, yes, was served. David will never walk free again. But justice does not fill empty chairs at family tables. It does not silence the grief in a daughter's voice or erase the emptiness in the lives Margaret touched. Her absence is a permanent wound, a silence so loud it drowns out everything else. In the end, a verdict could punish the man, but it could never restore the woman whose laughter, warmth, and trust were stolen. And so, we close not with relief, but with reflection. Margaret's story asks us to remember her not as a victim defined by her end, but as a woman who sought love in a world that betrayed her. That is the weight this trial leaves us with, and the question it presses into our hearts. How do we ensure the people we care for never fall? This has been the Crime Catalogue. If you made it this far, like, comment, and subscribe to hear the stories that must be told. And most importantly, share this video and thank you for watching.